All the forward-looking housing supply indicators are pointing down amid record population growth in Australia. My next guest says there's only one solution to Australia's housing crisis: reduce the rate of immigration. This week, you may have heard that Australia's population number clicked over the 27 million mark, way ahead of Commonwealth official forecasts. Australia simply can't build enough homes to keep up with the demand. So let's go to my guest, Leith Van Onselen. He's chief economist at a number of super funds. He's also the co-founder of the business analyst website Macro Business. Leith, what's the population of Australia now?
Well, Steve, it's actually just ticked over past 27 million people, can you believe? So it's and we've gotten there with a bullet. As your residents of Brisbane and Queensland probably know, and I live down here in Melbourne, our populations have been growing very strongly in the last 20 years. And in fact, the nation's population has grown by nearly 8.5 million people this century alone. So, it's incredibly fast growth, and it's all been brought to you by a friendly federal government, which has decided to obviously run a high immigration policy, and that's basically the reason for our strong population growth.
It's been a massive boom in the last 12 months. Leith Van Onselen, explain that to me.
Yeah, so basically last financial year, so we're talking about the 2022-2023 financial year, Australia added 518,000 net overseas migrants, which is the largest by a long shot. So basically the previous record was in about 2008 when we added 315,000. So that at that time was the highest net overseas migration in Australia's history. And last financial year, we absolutely smashed that with 518,000. And I'll just add that, Australia's hit this milestone more than 30 years faster than was projected by the Australian Treasury and its 2002 first intergenerational report. So basically, that report said that projected that Australia's net overseas migration would average 90,000 a year, which was sort of the norm back then. But in the 15 years leading up to the pandemic, the federal government decided to ramp that up to 220,000 a year. And now, post-pandemic, we've now a net overseas migration of nearly 520,000. And it's actually projected to fall a bit this year, but still be at 375,000, which would still be the second highest in Australia's history after last year's record.
So basically, we've added the entire population of Tasmania. We've added another Tasmania to Australia just in 12 months.
That's right. So in the 15 years leading up to the pandemic, we used to add a Canberra every year, and we've decided to beat that. And now we've added a Tasmania. This is the reason why your residents in Queensland, southeast Queensland, probably further north as well, are experiencing a monumental rental crisis. It's basically because we're bringing in massive amounts of migrants, mostly in Sydney and Melbourne, and also WA, would you believe? But then that's forcing Sydney and Melbourne people out of those places, and they're all rushing up to Queensland. And
yes, they
basically
are.
We're basically not building enough houses, infrastructure, or anything to keep up with it. So, and we haven't for 20 years, as your residents probably know firsthand from their own lived experience.
This is ABC Radio. I'm speaking with Leith Van Onselen. He's with the co-founder of Macro Business. He's chief economist at the MB Fund and MB Super. Steve Austin's my name. I'll get to the housing issue in a moment, but why are the Treasury forecasts wildly understating or wildly inaccurate in terms of population growth? I mean, how worthwhile are they if they've been massively wrong in understating the growth projections of the Australian population?
Yeah, well, I mean, they obviously understated the rebound that we got out of the pandemic. So basically, the first federal budget under this new government was done in October 2022, and that projected that we'd have 235,000 net overseas migration, and then obviously we've and then it revised it up at last year's at the last year's budget update, and then we obviously end up smashing that even further. One of the reasons why is that the federal government didn't anticipate this bigger jump in temporary arrivals, so especially international students and those sorts of things. So effectively, we've got two systems. So the federal government has a permanent migration system, which is around 215,000 a year once you count for humanitarian intake. and then also has a temporary system which is uncapped. And that's basically dominated by, student visa arrivals. And those student visa arrivals have been a lot stronger than what the government anticipated. And that's why I've got this, really strong net overseas migration.
Now, big business has been arguing for those overseas arrivals, demanding them. Their lobby group in Canberra, the Business Council of Australia, strong arms the government or really gets in the ear of the government, says, oh, no, we have to have this. Why?
Yeah, well, that's a fantastic point, Steve, and it's actually the reason why we're in the predicament we're in. So, as I said earlier, the first intergeneration report said that we'd have 90,000. They projected 90,000 net overseas migration a year. Now, at that same time in 2002, the Howard government ran a summit basically on Australia's, skills shortages, and it had the Business Council, the Australian Industry Group, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And they argued at the time that Australia needed to massively increase immigration, otherwise we'd have worsening skills shortages. So the federal government obliged, it ramped up immigration we've had for really the last 20 years. But the problem is, Steve, we've still got skill shortages, and I'd argue they're even worse. So we've effectively grown the population by about 8 million since that time, and we've still got these massive skills shortages. Now, the math for business is very simple. They love big migration because it boosts the number of customers. So, if you're a high-rise Harry Triggerbot building apartments, you've got more people to sell to, more banks to lend money to. More people for banks to lend money to. More sales if you're a Harvey Norman. So they love a bigger population because it's a way for them to make more money. At the same time, it puts downward pressure on wages in certain areas because you can, why employ a local when you can just grab someone from overseas who potentially can work for cheaper. So for them, it's a win-win. And that's why they always push for more migration because it's good for their profits effectively. And unfortunately, the federal government has obliged them for 20 years, and yet we've still got worse skills shortages than ever.
Leith, will those migration levels temper back down a bit? So the last 12 months looks like it's been a bit of an aberration. Is it?
Yeah, look, certainly they're not going to be at last year's level. So last year's level, again, were nearly 520,000, which is just unbelievable. That's about, double the pre-COVID average, which was already incredibly high, but on a historical basis. So they will come down, and the reason why they're going to come down is even if the number of arrivals stays the same, we're going to have more people leaving because, obviously at the start of the pandemic, a lot of migrants left. Then after the pandemic, we've had them coming in, but hardly anybody leaving, and then now we're going to have more normal departures. So they will come down, but that said, migration is tipped by the intergenerational report to remain high basically forever in a historical sense. So instead of being 520,000, it's tipped to be, close to 250,000 a year forever, which, just to put that in a historical perspective, we used to average about 90,000. That's what the first intergenerational report tipped.
Right.
And a level of nearly 250,000 is off the charts. Like that is very high, and that's basically what we had in the 15 years leading up to the pandemic, which created a lot of the problems that we're in now. This hasn't just come in the last year. This has been building for years because we haven't built enough housing and we haven't built enough infrastructure. Now, pretty much anybody who lives in Brisbane, Melbourne, or Sydney knows it.
Well, the effect here in Queensland, particularly in the cities, is unaffordable rents and very expensive housing now. Where only sort of a few years ago, it was an affordable place to buy a house. But so, what is this doing to the housing market here in Queensland and Australia, Leith Van Onselen?
Oh, look, it's absolutely disastrous. So effectively, Australia cannot build enough homes to keep up with the expansion of its population. That's plain to see. And look, Brisbane's taken longer to get there than Sydney and Melbourne. So most migrants come to Sydney and Melbourne first, and then Brisbane gets more the second round effects when Sydney and Melbourne people leave Sydney and Melbourne because it's unaffordable.
Yep.
And they go to Brisbane, which then pushes up Brisbane house prices. And that's effectively, so Brisbane the last couple of years has basically had catch up to Sydney and Melbourne, but Sydney and Melbourne's house prices have been unaffordable for decades since this whole fiasco started. And now Brisbane's starting to cop it because of the outflows. And effectively, we're seeing it across the rental market first because obviously the nation's rental vacancy rate across the capital cities is running about 1%, and that's about the lowest in history. And that just shows you we don't have enough houses for these people. And then obviously it's cascading into prices as well because we're getting this fear of missing out with people who can't get a rental or saying, look, I've got to buy no matter what because I don't want to be stuck as a renter. paying not just high rents, but not being able to get a rental property. And so it's a really double-edged sword for anybody trying to get a house. So whether if you're looking to buy, you're going to get absolutely smashed, and if you're renting, you're getting even harder smashed. And it really is a national problem, but it's worse in the major cities, unfortunately.
All the housing supply indicators are pointing downwards. We're going back. We're slowing down. All the data from the Master Builders Association shows we're actually slowing the rate of building new homes here in Queensland, at least. So does this mean that Australia's housing shortage is going to continue for a number of years?
Oh, absolutely. So basically, as you said, Steve, all the forward-looking indicators on housing construction are looking terrible. So basically, dwelling, approvals, dwelling commencements, dwelling completions, that's all data released by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Loans for new houses, everything is running around decade lows. So they've all collapsed. And based on those data, we're looking at about 160,000 new homes being built a year, when we've got the population that's just risen by, if you count not just migration, but also other population growth, around 620,000 people. So it's not nearly enough. And unfortunately, the federal government's launched this, 1.2 million homes over 5 years initiative, which requires 240,000 a year. Well, we're running, 70,000 plus below that level. And there's just no way it's going to keep up.
Crikey.
When you have high interest rates, you've got builders falling over left, right and centre, and high materials costs and also labour shortages. So basically the only solution to Australia's housing crisis is to dramatically cut immigration, because you've got to take the pressure off demand, because the way it is at the moment, demand through population growth is going to run ahead of supply for years, and we're going to have a worsening housing problem, a worsening rental crisis, higher prices and higher rents. That's the bottom line.
We've got a massive homelessness problem here in southeast Queensland, Leith Van Onselen. You would see a couple of sort of homeless people around the streets of Brisbane City, but now there's little mini tent cities springing up in the parks and gardens. You're seeing people clustering together in tents because they either can't go to home or cannot afford rent, more likely. Why is the federal government, which is responsible for immigration, why are they not, if they're serious about fixing the housing market, why are they not tackling the immigration levels into Australia at the moment?
Yeah, there's two reasons for that. First of all, it's obviously big business wants the immigration, as I said before, because it's good for their profits. Secondly, high migration is, on the surface, good for the federal government, because it does boost federal budget revenues, because the federal budget collects most of the tax revenue in the nation, collects all the company tax and all the personal tax. And if you just grow the population, you're going to get more tax because you've got more people to tax. The problem is the cost of all that falls on the state governments who lose, and it falls on us as individuals, because the states then, have to privatise everything to build more infrastructure, so we end up paying more in toll roads and that sort of thing. So unfortunately, the federal government's wedded to this, and it's the reason why they always bang on about, it's a supply problem, because we're not building enough homes. Well, we're not building enough homes because we're bringing in too many people. It's really a demand problem. It's not a supply problem.
Crikey. Happy Australia Day, Leith Van Onselen.
Yeah, no worries, Steve. Thanks very much, mate. Anytime.
Leith Van Onselen, economist, previously worked at the Commonwealth Treasury in Canberra and a range of other positions. These days, he's co-founder of the economic and business website Macro Business. This is ABC Radio Brisbane and ABC Radio Queensland. This week,